Finally, his fourth credential, and I say this for last because this is the most convincing one of all. The ultimate authentication of his claim to being the Son of God is that he was resurrected from the dead. Now, I started as a real skeptic about the resurrection of Jesus. I've been a newspaper reporter. I've seen dead bodies. I've never seen a dead body come back to life. But according to these ancient records, Jesus did 3 days after he was put to death. So as I began to investigate, I talk about this evidence much more in detail in my book, The Case for Christ. But I became convinced that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the best attested event of the ancient world. Let me just give you a few bits of evidence to back that up. First, the empty tomb of Jesus. Did you know that everybody in the ancient world agreed that the tomb of Jesus was empty on that first Easter morning? Everybody conceded it was empty. The question became, well, how did it get empty? The religious authorities concocted the absurd story that the disciples had stolen the body, even though they lacked motive and they lacked opportunity. Besides which, why would the disciples want to steal the body just so they could be tortured to death for a lie? Doesn't make sense. Now, by the way, when we talk about the empty tomb, one of the most fascinating bits of corroboration of that is the fact that the gospel writers report that it was women who discovered the tomb empty. Why is that significant? It's important because in the first century Jewish culture, the testimony of women was not considered reliable. They could not even testify in a court of law. And so, if the writers of the gospel were going to try to, if they felt the freedom to make things up and just generate whatever, just, make it up as they go, they would never have said that women discovered the tomb empty, because that hurts their case in the first century. That audience are trying to convince it's an actual historical event. They would have said Peter discovered the tomb empty, John discovered the tomb empty, some man discovered the tomb empty. Why would they hurt their own case by saying that it was women that discovered the tomb empty? The only explanation I could come up with was, that's what happened. And they just were merely reporting the truth and letting the chips fall where they may, even though it was very inconvenient for them. The second strand of evidence for the resurrection is the 515 eyewitnesses who personally encountered the resurrected Jesus. I've interviewed eminent psychologists who told me convincingly that this could not have been the product of hallucinations. Among the eyewitnesses were skeptics like Saul of Tarsus, who was a persecutor of Christians, and James, the half-brother of Jesus, who wasn't a follower of Jesus during his lifetime. Both were radically transformed when they encountered the resurrected Jesus. Saul turned into the Apostle Paul, the greatest missionary of all time, and James converted and becoming a leader in the early church. Both of them and the disciples were willing to die, declaring that Jesus Christ really is the unique Son of God who proved it by returning from the dead. Now you might say, well, people have died for religious beliefs all through history. Now this is different. This is very different. This isn't like some terrorist who kills himself with a suicide bomb or flying an airplane into a building because he sincerely believes if he dies that way, he'll go to paradise to be with his God. That terrorist can only believe that is true. But you know what? He doesn't know for a fact that it's true. He can only believe it. In contrast, the disciples in all of history were in a unique position to know for a fact that Jesus returned from the dead. They didn't just believe it. They knew it was true. They touched him. They ate with him. They talked with him. They encountered him. They knew the truth. And knowing the truth of the resurrection, they were willing to die for it. Do you see the difference? The terrorist can't know the truth. He can only believe it and hope it's true. And yeah, he's willing to die. In contrast, the disciples knew the truth, and knowing the truth, were willing to die. And friends, nobody knowingly and willingly dies for a lie. Third strand of evidence is the early nature of these resurrection accounts. I mentioned earlier this creed of the early church that's preserved in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 and following, that affirms the resurrection, lists the names of specific eyewitnesses, including skeptics, and it's been dated back as early as 24 months after the event. And the beliefs that make up that creed go right back to the cross itself. It would be unprecedented anywhere in the history of the world for legend to grow up that quickly and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. With the conclusion of my investigation, I found myself forced to agree with a guy who was sort of my hero when I went to law school. His name is Sir Lionel Luckhoo. Sir Lionel Luckhoo, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, was the most successful lawyer who ever lived. And this guy, as a defense attorney, won over 400 murder trials in a row, either before a jury or on appeal. He was unbelievable. He was a real-life Perry Mason. Brilliant legal intellect. And he was a skeptic about the resurrection, until someone challenged him to take his monumental legal skill and apply it to the historical record for the resurrection of Jesus and come to a conclusion. He spent years doing that, and I will sum up for you one sentence that concludes his investigation. He said, quote, "I say unequivocally that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubt." This from the greatest lawyer who ever lived.